to start off with, I'd love to hear how you define health in the modern world.
So I think in this day and age, we have to include both physical and mental health. You can't just have one without the other. And yesterday, I actually looked up the World Health Organization's definition of what health is. And I'm pleased to say that it does now include mental health as well as physical health, although I'm sure that hasn't always been the case. I mean, I know that in the past, I have found that people don't necessarily think of mental health as important as physical health. But the WHO defined it as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So I think that sounds pretty thorough. So I'm going to go with that one.
No, that is very thorough. That is very thorough. And what are the experiences that you've had in the past that underpin your definition of health as an individual? Because I know you've had an evolution of sorts in many, many different ways that means that I think from what I've gathered, you align quite closely with the World Health Organization's definition. So what are the sort of key life experiences, upbringing, experiences as a teenager, and everything that's got you to this point that mean you align with that definition?
Yeah, so when I was younger, I suffered a kind of version of orthorexia, which is a kind of an addiction to eating as healthily as possible. And the irony is that, of course, you go down the route of eating as healthily as possible and you end up extremely unhealthy because of it. So I know that there is such thing as too healthy when it comes to food. And I think when the definition of health doesn't incorporate the mental side of things, you kind of risk losing the overall holistic version of health. And I think a lot of people, if they'd looked at me back then, they would have thought, oh, she looks really healthy. You know, she's got a healthy BMI or a healthy physique or whatever. When in reality, I was really struggling to get out of bed in the morning. I was really struggling to concentrate at school, spent a good deal of my time crying. And I don't think we can really count that as being totally healthy. I mean, if you'd asked me at the time, did I feel healthy? I would have undoubtedly said absolutely not. So I think if we don't include mental health in the definition, then we can't have this holistic view of what healthy is.
I 100% agree. And actually, orthorexia is not something I've ever really discussed too openly because it's not as commonly known as other eating disorders, but it's definitely something that I suffered with as a 17/18-year-old. So I can still remember, and I'm not going to bother, but I could recount the breakfast, 11 o'clock snack, 12:30 lunch, 3 o'clock snack, dinner, and before bed snack I had for almost 18 months verbatim because it was always the same all day, every day because it was a control thing for me.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah,
actually
very
took
familiar.
being on a holiday with my friends where we were given food where I literally didn't have a choice, whereby you eat this or you don't eat. And that was what actually slowly allowed me to find a healthier version of what outwardly was being deemed healthy. So, no, it's always
Yeah.
always fascinating to speak to somebody who understands the sort of nuances of that specific eating disorder. And it never really affected me too directly, but it was definitely something that retrospectively I've acknowledged as a self-diagnosis, I'd say.
Well, I think actually probably a lot more people, sorry to interrupt, I think a lot more people than we think actually struggle with it because I think social media can often reward behaviors that in everyday life actually might not be healthy. And I think that's why this conversation about mental health is so important. Because if they look at their life and think, look, well, I feel like I'm doing all the right things. I feel like I'm being really healthy. And then why aren't I happy? It might click in people's head and think, oh, well, hang on a second. If we're going to include happiness and mental health in our definition of health, then maybe there are some things that need to change. Maybe I need to let go control a little bit. And I think it's great that these conversations are happening.
100%, and I'm much happier taking a less dogmatic approach to things now, because it's freed me from the sort of prison of pressure that I put myself in, whereby I went through a phase where I was 18 where I just said no, I'm not going to drink. As an 18-year-old growing up in Scotland, that's very niche, let me tell you. So I took that because I thought a dogmatic solution would make it easier for me to be in constant control. But what's the flip side of that? I was missing out on social occasions. I was leaving things early because I wasn't part of the social interaction, which in my mind is a key component of overall holistic health. So I think that the parameters have shifted, which is fantastic. But as you've said, the flip side is we've now got other elements of quote unquote orthorexia whereby you need to get out of out of bed at 5 a.m. Otherwise, you're not doing well enough. These sort of things, which are equally as damaging and don't account for the relative demands of the individual.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, what behaviors and practice are essential? Well, what behaviors and practices rather are essential to you on a day-to-day basis to basically fulfill that definition?
Well, I think you touched on it really nicely before talking about balance. And so for me, keeping healthy is about far more than just keeping fit. Although, I mean, anyone who follows me know that I really love keeping fit as well. But I view that as part of the balance of keeping healthy. So it's not just about going running several times a week and going to the gym. It's also about making sure that I get out for fresh air and that I listen to birdsong and that I eat loads of variety of food every day, every week, and that I speak to my friends and family regularly, and that I have some variety in my work and also the balance between work and play and rest, especially. And also, one thing, it might sound really wanky, but gratitude, I think, is really important for me. I used to keep a gratitude journal, and while I don't do that anymore, it was probably the biggest thing that changed me from being a very negative, pessimistic thinker where every situation had a negative to the sort of person where in every single situation, even if it is actually quite a bad situation, I can almost always think of the positive, and I try to go through life looking at the positives in things. And that doesn't mean that I don't struggle with things, and it doesn't mean that I am toxically positive or whatever. I still very much understand that we have different emotions other than the positive ones, and I respect that. But actually, I think looking at the positives in life can really make a big difference to how happy you are. And you're the only person who loses if you're always thinking negatively, and you're the person who wins if you're trying to think positively. So I try and encompass that in everyday life.